The first shot rang out as Margaret Valenti plunged her hands into the soapy washbasin, causing her to flinch but not stop her work. In Sacramento, California, of 1876, gunfire wasn't uncommon, especially not in the dusty section of town where she had set up her laundry business, a small wooden structure with a clothesline stretching across the back lot like a surrender flag to the harsh realities of the West. Margaret didn't look up when the saloon doors across the street burst open and 5 men spilled out, their boots pounding against the wooden boardwalk as they fled. She recognized them instantly. The Mason gang, notorious for robbing stage coaches and trains throughout California's gold country. Their leader, a hard-faced man named Jeremiah Mason, tipped his hat to her as they passed. Their clothes would be in her washtub by morning, just as they had been every week for the past 6 months. At 26, Margaret had learned that survival often meant keeping your head down and your opinions to yourself. Her laundry service had flourished precisely because she was discreet. Sacramento had grown from a gold rush outpost into a bustling city, but its underbelly remained wild and untamed. The railroad had brought civilization, but it had also brought those who preyed upon it. "Those men are trouble, Miss Valenti," Sheriff Thompson said, appearing beside her washtub as she scrubbed at a particularly stubborn bloodstain on what she knew to be Mason's shirt. "You ought to consider refusing their business." Margaret didn't pause in her scrubbing. "I'm a washerwoman, Sheriff. I don't ask questions about whose clothes I clean. Perhaps you should." The sheriff's mustache twitched with disapproval. "Folks are starting to talk." "Guilt by association, you understand." Margaret finally looked up, her brown eyes steady. "I understand I need to eat, and I understand that clean shirts don't make clean men, but they don't make me dirty either." The sheriff departed with a warning glance, and Margaret returned to her work. Her fingers were raw from the lye soap. Her back ached from bending over the washtub, but the alternative, returning to the saloon where she'd once worked serving drinks to handsy minors, was unthinkable. This laundry business was hers alone, built from nothing after her father had gambled away their savings and drunk himself to death 3 years prior. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the street, Margaret hung the last of the day's washing. The distant sound of horses approaching made her pause. A small group of riders appeared at the end of the street, dust clouds billowing behind them. At their lead was a man she'd never seen before, tall and broad-shouldered with a face weathered by sun and wind. His dark hair was slightly too long, and he wore a marshal's badge that caught the fading sunlight. The strangers dismounted outside the sheriff's office, but the leader's eyes found Margaret across the street. For a moment, they locked gazes, and something unfamiliar fluttered in her chest. Later that evening, as Margaret was closing up shop, a knock came at her door. The marshal stood there, hat in hand. "Evening, madam. Name's Levi Sutter, U.S. Marshal. I was hoping to ask you a few questions." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron. "I've already spoken to the sheriff today, Marshal." "I reckon you have," he said, his voice deep and calm like distant thunder. "Mind if I come in anyway?" Reluctantly, she stepped aside. The marshal's presence seemed to fill her small living quarters behind the laundry. He smelled of leather, tobacco, and the open plains. "You wash for the Mason gang," he said. It wasn't a question. "I wash for anyone with coin," Margaret replied, crossing her arms. "I don't ask what they do when they're not bringing me their dirty laundry." Marshal Sutter studied her face. "Madam, those men killed 2 guards during a train robbery last week. They're wanted in 3 states. Margaret's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "That's unfortunate, but it doesn't change the fact that I'm just doing honest work. I'm not their accomplice." "The town's beginning to think otherwise." He placed his hat on her table. "I've been tracking them for months. They're careful, but men like that make mistakes. They trust you?" "They don't trust me," Margaret corrected. "They just don't see me. There's a difference." A slight smile touched the marshal's lips. "That could be useful." Margaret raised her eyebrows. "If you're suggesting I spy on my customers, I'm afraid I must decline. I may just be a washerwoman, but I have my principles." Principles are a luxury out here, Sutter remarked, picking up his hat. But I respect your position. Just be careful, Miss Valenti. Clean work only stays clean when you know who you're working for. He turned to leave but paused at the door. How did you know my name? I don't believe I offered it. I asked around, he admitted. You've made quite a reputation for yourself. Best laundress in Sacramento, they say. Is that all they say? Margaret asked, knowing the answer. His eyes met hers directly. No, it's not, but I prefer to form my own opinions about people. After he left, Margaret sat at her small table, thinking about the Mason gang and the blood she'd washed from their clothes over the months. Had she been willfully blind? The money they paid had saved her business more than once. The next morning, Margaret was up before dawn, heating water for the day's washing. She'd barely slept, Marshal Sutter's words echoing in her mind. She was arranging her washboards when the door swung open. Jeremiah Mason stood there, his gang lurking behind him. Morning, Miss Valenti, he said with a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. Got some washing needs doing. He dropped a bundle of clothes on her counter more than usual. Margaret noticed dark stains that looked suspiciously like blood. The usual rate. She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Double today, Mason replied, placing a heavy purse beside the clothes. And I'd appreciate extra care with these. Had ourselves a bit of a situation last night, Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Mason leaned across the counter, his voice dropping to a whisper. Heard you had a visitor yesterday, the new marshal. Her blood ran cold. He was asking questions around town, just doing his job, I suppose. Sure, Mason straightened up. Just remember who's been putting food on your table all these months, Miss Valenti. I remember who pays for my services, Mr. Mason. Nothing more, nothing less. He tipped his hat. Smart girl. We'll be back tomorrow for those clothes. After they left, Margaret stared at the blood-stained bundle. With shaking hands, she began to sort through the items. Among them, she found a torn waistcoat with a railroad company insignia, the same company whose train had been robbed the previous week. The bell above her door jingled, and Margaret hurriedly shoved the waistcoat under a pile of other laundry. Marshal Sutter stood in the doorway, watching her with those penetrating eyes. More laundry from your regular customers? He asked, stepping inside. As I said, Marshal, I provide a service without asking questions. He moved closer, his gaze falling to her hands. You're trembling, Miss Valenti? It's cold this morning, she lied. His hand caught her wrist gently as she reached for a washboard. These hands tell a different story. They've seen hard work, but they've never stopped being gentle. Don't throw that away for men who don't deserve your loyalty. Margaret pulled her hand free. What do you want from me, Marshal? To betray my customers, to become an informant? And then what happens to me when they find out? When no one in town will trust me with their laundry because I turned on the Mason gang, I can protect you, Sutter said softly. Margaret laughed bitterly. Like the law protected my mother when my father beat her, like it protected my father when loan sharks came calling. The law is for people with money and power, Marshal. The rest of us just try to survive. A shadow passed over his face. Not all lawmen are the same, Miss Valenti. Some of us remember why we took the badge in the first place. And why did you? She asked, suddenly curious. He looked away toward the window. My sister was killed by men like the Masons, men who thought they could take whatever they wanted and leave nothing but grief behind. The confession hung in the air between them. Margaret felt her resolve weakening. They'll be back tomorrow for their clothes, she said finally. They mentioned having a situation last night. Marshal Sutter's expression sharpened. Did they say where they're headed next? No, Margaret admitted. But there was this. She pulled out the torn waistcoat with the railroad insignia. The marshal examined it carefully. Pacific Western Railroad. Their payroll train runs tomorrow. He looked up at her. This is important evidence, Miss Valenti. Evidence that I'm holding stolen property, she pointed out. Or evidence that you're assisting the law. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather case. This belonged to the guard they killed. His wife asked me to find it. It contains a portrait of their children. Margaret took the case with trembling hands and opened it. Two small faces smiled back at her from a tintype photograph. Something inside her shifted, like tectonic plates realigning. She thought of all the clothes she'd washed over the months, of all the stains she'd chosen not to question. "What would you have me do?" she asked quietly. "When they come back tomorrow, act normal. I'll have men watching. Once they leave, we'll follow them to their hideout. And what about me? Once they realize I helped you, I'm as good as dead in this town." Marshal Sutter's gaze was steady. "Then perhaps it's time for a fresh start somewhere else." After he left, Margaret worked mechanically through the day's washing, her mind racing. By evening, she had made her decision. When she returned the freshly laundered clothes to the Mason gang the next day, she would help the marshal. Not for the law, but for the children in that photograph. That night, as Margaret was closing up shop, she heard a commotion in the alley behind her laundry. Cautiously, she peered through the back window. Two members of the Mason gang, Hank and Durrell, were talking in hushed, angry tones. "Mason's getting careless," Hank was saying. "That marshal's been asking questions all over town. We should lie low, skip the train job tomorrow." "Too late," Durrell replied. "Plans are set. Besides, this'll be our biggest score yet. Mason says we'll have enough to head south after this, maybe even to Mexico." Margaret's heart raced. The Mason gang was planning to leave town after tomorrow's robbery. She had to tell Marshal Sutter. She waited until the men had gone before slipping out her front door and hurrying toward the hotel where the marshal was staying. The streets were dark, lit only by occasional lamps that cast more shadows than light. She was nearly at the hotel when a hand clamped over her mouth and she was dragged into an alley. Jeremiah Mason's voice hissed in her ear. "Going somewhere, Miss Valenti? Perhaps to see your new friend the marshal." Fear froze her blood as Mason spun her around to face him. "I heard an interesting rumor today," he continued. "Seems our laundress was seen having quite the conversation with the law. Made me wonder what else you might be washing besides our clothes." "I don't know what you mean," Margaret managed to say. "I was just heading to deliver some mending to Mrs. Thornton at the hotel. At this hour, I don't think so." Mason pulled a knife from his belt. "I trusted you, Margaret. That was my mistake." Just as he raised the knife, a gunshot echoed through the alley. Mason staggered, clutching his shoulder. Marshal Sutter stood at the alley entrance, his revolver still raised. "Step away from the lady," Sutter commanded. Mason sneered but complied, backing toward the other end of the alley. "This isn't over," he warned before disappearing into the darkness. Sutter hurried to Margaret, his hands gently checking her for injuries. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, still trembling. "How did you know?" "I've been keeping an eye on your place," he admitted. "When I saw you leave in such a hurry, I followed. Good thing I did." "They know," Margaret said urgently. "They suspect I've been talking to you, and they're planning to rob the payroll train tomorrow before fleeing south." Sutter's jaw tightened. "You can't go back to your laundry. It's not safe." "But all my things can be replaced," he finished firmly. "Your life can't." He took her to the hotel, arranging for a room under his protection. As they parted for the night, Margaret caught his arm. "Why are you helping me?" "Beyond just catching the Masons," Sutter looked down at her, something unspoken passing between them. "Because from the moment I rode into town and saw you hanging laundry in the sunset, I knew you were someone worth knowing. Someone with fire in her soul, even if she hides it behind soap suds and starched collars." His words warmed her in a way she hadn't felt in years. "Thank you, Marshal." "Levi," he corrected gently. "After all this, I think you've earned the right to use my given name." The next morning, Sutter gathered a posse of deputies and local lawmen. Their plan was to intercept the Mason gang at the train station before the robbery could take place. Margaret, against Sutter's wishes, insisted on being nearby. "I need to see this through," she told him. "I need to know it ends." Reluctantly, he agreed, positioning her in a milliner's shop across from the station with strict instructions to stay hidden. From her vantage point, Margaret watched as the Mason gang arrived, looking unusually tense. Jeremiah's arm was in a crude sling and his face was pale with pain. The lawmen were in position, disguised as railroad workers and passengers. As the train pulled into the station with a screech of brakes and billowing steam, the gang made their move. But the marshal was ready. "U.S. Marshal, hands in the air," Sutter's voice boomed across the platform. Chaos erupted. Guns blazed, people screamed and scattered. Margaret watched in horror as Jeremiah Mason spotted her in the shop window. With a snarl of rage, he broke away from the gunfight and charged toward her. Margaret ran to the back of the shop, looking frantically for an exit. She found a door leading to an alley and burst through it, only to find Mason waiting for her, having circled around the building. "You did this," he growled, advancing on her. "You betrayed us." Margaret backed away. "You betrayed yourselves when you chose to rob and kill innocent people. And what do you think will happen now? You think that Marshall will save you? Men like him use people like you and move on. At least I paid you fairly for your work." "There's nothing fair about blood money," Margaret replied, surprised by her own courage. Mason lunged for her, but before he could reach her, Levi Sutter appeared at the end of the alley. "It's over, Mason," he called. "Your men are either dead or in custody. Drop your weapon." Mason laughed, a harsh sound like breaking glass. "Maybe so, but I can still take her with me." He raised his gun toward Margaret. 2 shots rang out simultaneously. Mason crumpled to the ground, and Margaret felt a searing pain in her arm. She looked down to see blood spreading across her sleeve before the world tilted sideways. When she awoke, she was in a bed at the doctor's house. Levi sat beside her, his hat in his hands and worry etched on his face. He brightened when he saw her eyes open. "Welcome back," he said softly. Margaret tried to sit up, wincing at the pain in her arm. "Mason, dead, as are 2 of his men. The others are in custody. My laundry." A shadow crossed his face. "I'm sorry, Margaret. They burned it down before we could stop them." Tears welled in her eyes. Everything she had worked for gone in an instant. "What happens now?" Levi took her hand gently. "That depends on you. The railroad company is offering a reward for your help in stopping the robbery. It's enough to start over somewhere." "Somewhere," Margaret repeated. "But where?" "I've been offered a position as sheriff in a town called Silver Creek, up north near the Sierra Nevada. It's a growing place, respectable, could use a good laundress." He hesitated. "Or you could go anywhere else. The choice is yours." Margaret studied his face, seeing something there that made her heart quicken. "Why Silver Creek, Marshal Sutter? Is it just the job?" He smiled slightly. "No, it's not just the job. I find myself not wanting to say goodbye to a certain laundress who's braver than most men I know. But I wouldn't presume to." Margaret squeezed his hand, cutting him off. "I've never seen the Sierra Nevada." The relief and joy that spread across his face told her everything she needed to know. 2 weeks later, Margaret's arm was healing well, and she was preparing to leave Sacramento. The town had been abuzz with the story of how she had helped bring down the notorious Mason gang. Some called her a hero, others a traitor to her customers. Either way, her laundry business was in ashes, and there was nothing to keep her in a town full of memories and whispers. Levi had gone ahead to Silver Creek to arrange things, promising to return for her. As Margaret packed her few remaining possessions, saved from the fire by being in her small living quarters, a knock came at the door of the room she'd rented. It was Mrs. Thornton, the hotel owner's wife and one of Margaret's former customers. "I heard you were leaving," she said, holding out a package. "The ladies and I wanted you to have this." Inside was a beautiful dress of blue calico, perfect for traveling. "We know you lost everything in the fire," Mrs. Thornton explained, "and not everyone thinks you did wrong. Some of us understand what it means to make difficult choices." Touched, Margaret thanked her. The next morning, wearing her new dress, she boarded the stagecoach that would take her north. Levi was waiting at the depot, his smile widening at the sight of her. "You look beautiful," he said, helping her down. "It's just a new dress," she replied, though she couldn't help smiling back. "It's not the dress. he assured her. Silver Creek proved to be everything Levi had described: a town nestled among pines with a main street of neat businesses and homes. It had grown prosperous from both mining and lumber, and unlike Sacramento's rougher districts, it seemed to be striving for respectability. Levi showed her to a small building near the center of town. "The town council approved this for your laundry," he explained. "It needs some work, but it has a good water supply and living quarters in the back." Margaret walked through the space, envisioning washboards and drying lines, soap barrels and ironing tables. "It's perfect," she said softly. "But can the town really afford another laundry?" "The Chinese laundry on the edge of town can't keep up with demand," Levi explained. "Besides, the ladies of Silver Creek have already been asking when you'll be open for business. Word travels fast out here." "What word exactly?" Margaret asked, suddenly anxious. "About the Mason gang." Levi shook his head. "Only that you're the best laundress in California and that you're under the sheriff's protection." His eyes held hers. "Which you are, Margaret, always." The weeks that followed were busy ones. Margaret set up her new laundry, carefully building her reputation in this new town. Levi settled into his role as sheriff, a position that seemed to suit him better than the wandering life of a marshal. They saw each other often. He would stop by her shop in the mornings and evenings, sometimes bringing coffee or fresh bread from the bakery. Their friendship deepened, though neither spoke of what had passed between them in Sacramento. Margaret sensed that Levi was giving her time and space to find her footing, and she appreciated it. After a lifetime of men who took without asking, his patience was a revelation. As summer turned to fall, Silver Creek prepared for its harvest festival. The town would be full of visitors from surrounding areas, and Margaret's laundry business was busier than ever, with people wanting their best clothes cleaned for the celebration. The night before the festival, Levi invited her to dinner at the town's best restaurant. She wore the blue calico dress, now kept for special occasions, and felt a flutter of anticipation as she met him outside the sheriff's office. "You look mighty fine, Miss Valenti," he said, offering his arm. "As do you, Sheriff Sutter," she replied, noting his freshly pressed shirt and polished boots. Over dinner, they talked about the town, their work, and their pasts. Levi told her more about his sister, whose death had driven him to become a lawman. Margaret shared stories of her mother, who had taught her to take pride in even the humblest work. "She always said that clean work stays clean," Margaret mused. "I didn't understand what she meant until recently. It's not about the laundry, it's about integrity. About not letting your circumstances soil who you are inside." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," Levi remarked. "She was. I wish she could have seen me now with my own business again." "She would be proud," Levi assured her. "As am I." As they walked back through the town, the stars twinkling above the pine-covered hills, Levi stopped by the creek that gave the town its name. In the moonlight, the water shimmered like liquid silver. "I have something to ask you," he said, suddenly serious. "Something I've been wanting to ask for weeks now." Margaret's heart quickened. "Yes. I know it hasn't been long since Sacramento, and I'd understand if you need more time, but I find myself thinking about you from morning till night, wondering if you might one day consider." He took a breath. "Margaret, I'm asking if you might consider becoming my wife." Though she had begun to hope for this moment, the reality of it still took her breath away. "Levi, we barely know each other." "We know what matters," he countered gently. "We've seen each other in danger, in fear, in courage." "I know your heart, Margaret Valenti, and it's the finest I've ever known." Tears pricked her eyes. "And if people talk, if they remember the laundress who washed for Outlaws, then they'll also remember the woman brave enough to stand against them when it mattered." He took her hands in his. "Besides, out here, most folks have pasts they'd rather leave behind. What matters is the future we build." Margaret thought of all she had endured in Sacramento, of the new life she was building here. And most of all, she thought of this man before her, steady, honorable, and looking at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Yes," she said simply. "I will marry you, Levi Sutter." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains as he gathered her in his arms and kissed her beneath the starlit sky. They married 2 weeks later in Silver Creek's small church. The town turned out in force not just for their sheriff, but for the laundress who had quickly become a respected member of the community. Margaret wore a cream-colored dress that Mrs. Thornton had sent from Sacramento as a wedding gift, and Levi looked handsome in a new black suit. After the ceremony, as they greeted well-wishers, an older woman approached them. "Sheriff Sutter, Mrs. Sutter," she said with a smile. "I'm Judith Wells from the Pacific Western Railroad. My husband was one of the guards who survived the Mason gang's previous robbery attempt." Margaret tensed slightly, but Levi's hand on her back was reassuring. "The company wanted me to deliver this personally," Mrs. Wells continued, handing them an envelope. "It's the reward money, of course, but also a letter of commendation and free rail passes for life on our lines. What you did in Sacramento saved lives, Mrs. Sutter." "Thank you," Margaret said, touched by the gesture. "Please tell your husband I'm glad he survived." As Mrs. Wells moved away, Levi leaned down to whisper, "See, clean work stays clean." That night, in the small house Levi had purchased for them at the edge of town, close enough for him to reach the sheriff's office quickly if needed, but far enough to offer privacy, Margaret found herself overcome with emotion. "What is it?" Levi asked, concerned. "I'm just thinking about how far I've come," she admitted. "From washing blood-stained shirts for Outlaws to being married to the sheriff." He drew her into his arms. "Life has a way of taking unexpected turns." "I never thought I'd find this," she confessed. "A place where I belong. Someone who sees me for who I really am." "I saw you that first day in Sacramento," Levi said softly. "A woman with strength and dignity, even standing over a washtub. I knew then that you were someone special." Their kiss deepened, and as they came together as husband and wife, Margaret felt the last shadows of her past wash away in the tide of Levi's love. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys to Silver Creek. The town continued to grow, attracting more families and businesses. Margaret's laundry thrived, and she eventually hired 2 young women to help with the increasing workload. Levi's fair and firm approach to law enforcement earned him the respect of the townsfolk and the surrounding communities. Their first child, a son they named James, was born a year after their marriage. He had Levi's dark hair and Margaret's thoughtful eyes. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Sophia, whose arrival coincided with the completion of their new, larger home on a pretty piece of land just outside town. Life wasn't without its difficulties. A harsh winter in their 3rd year of marriage brought illness to the town, and both James and Levi fell sick with fever. Margaret spent sleepless nights tending to them, praying for their recovery. When they finally turned the corner toward health, she collapsed from exhaustion, and it was Levi's turn to care for her. "You can't leave me," he told her as he bathed her feverish brow. "We've only just begun our story." Through sheer determination, they all survived, emerging from that winter with a deeper appreciation for the fragility and preciousness of their life together. As the children grew, Margaret began to take a more active role in the town beyond her laundry business. She organized a lending library, taught reading to the children of miners and loggers, and started a women's aid society to help those in need. One summer day, as Margaret was hanging laundry in the yard with 6-year-old James helping by tangling more sheets than he smoothed, a stranger rode up to their gate. He was a rough-looking man with a weathered face and eyes that darted nervously. "Madam," he called. "I'm looking for the laundress. Got some washing needs doing." Margaret regarded him carefully, noting the bulge of a gun beneath his coat and the nervous way he kept looking down the road. "I'm the laundress," she said, moving slightly to place herself between the man and James. "But I'm not taking new customers at present. The laundry in town might help you," the man frowned. "Heard you were the best, that you don't ask questions about stains and such." A chill ran through Margaret despite the summer heat. "You heard wrong, mister. I run a respectable business here." He dismounted anyway, taking a step toward the gate. "I got good money to pay." "And I have a husband who's the sheriff," Margaret replied evenly, "as well as a shotgun of my own. Now, I suggest you take your laundry elsewhere." The man stared at her for a long moment before spitting in the dust. "Heard different about you. Heard you used to wash for the Mason gang back in Sacramento." "That was a different life," Margaret said firmly, "and those men are dead or in prison now. I suggest you remember that before deciding whose path to follow." Something in her voice must have convinced him, for he remounted his horse. "No offense meant, madam, just looking for some clean clothes." "The Chinese laundry in town is excellent," she told him, "and they don't ask questions either, but this is a peaceful town, stranger." "We aim to keep it that way." After he'd ridden off, Margaret gathered James close, her heart pounding. When Levi came home that evening, she told him about the encounter. "I'll keep an eye out for him," Levi promised, his face grave. "You did right to send him away." "It was strange," Margaret admitted. "For a moment it felt like Sacramento all over again, as if the past was reaching out to pull me back." Levi's arms encircled her. "The past only has the power we give it, love. You've built a new life here, we both have." "I know," she sighed. "It just reminded me how fragile happiness can be." "Not fragile," Levi corrected. "Precious. There's a difference." The stranger didn't return, but the incident prompted Levi to teach Margaret more about handling firearms. "Not that I expect trouble," he explained as they practiced shooting at targets behind their property, "but I sleep better knowing you can protect yourself and the children if needed." Margaret proved to be a natural shot, much to Levi's pride and her own surprise. "My father would be shocked," she laughed after hitting the center of a target. "He always said women had no business with guns." "Your father was wrong about many things," Levi replied, kissing her temple. "I'm glad you don't take after him." As their 10th anniversary approached, Silver Creek had grown into a prosperous small city. The railroad had extended a spur line to serve the lumber mills and mines, bringing more commerce and travelers. Margaret had sold her laundry business to her 2 employees, choosing instead to focus on the children and her community work. Levi, now in his mid-40s with silver threading his dark hair, remained sheriff but had trained several deputies to handle most of the day-to-day work. "I'm getting too old to chase young hooligans across the countryside," he joked, though Margaret knew the real reason was his desire to spend more time with his family. For their anniversary, Levi surprised Margaret with tickets to San Francisco. 10 days away from everything, he promised. "The children will stay with the Hendersons. You've always wanted to see the city." The journey by train was a delight, with the Central Pacific Railroad providing them a private compartment in honor of Levi's law enforcement service. Margaret watched in wonder as the landscape changed from mountains to valleys to the busy approaches to San Francisco Bay. The city itself was a revelation, bustling with people from all over the world, filled with elegant shops and restaurants, and dominated by the spectacular bay. They stayed in a fine hotel, attended the theater, and walked arm in arm along the bustling wharves. On their last evening in the city, as they dined in the hotel's restaurant, a distinguished-looking gentleman approached their table. "Excuse me," he said. "Are you Sheriff Levi Sutter of Silver Creek?" Levi nodded cautiously. "I am, and you are," Jonathan Prescott, governor's office. The man extended his hand. "I thought it was you. The governor speaks highly of your work in maintaining peace in the Sierra mining regions." Levi shook the offered hand. "Just doing my job, Mr. Prescott." "Well, the governor believes you could do more. He's looking for a new U.S. Marshal for the Northern District. Your name is at the top of his list." Margaret's heart sank. Being a marshal would mean long absences, dangerous work, everything they had built their life to avoid. Levi seemed to read her thoughts. "I'm flattered, Mr. Prescott, but I'm happy where I am. Silver Creek is home." The man looked surprised. "It's quite a step up, Sheriff." "More authority, better pay." "And less time with my family," Levi countered. "Please thank the governor for his consideration, but I must decline." After Prescott left, Margaret reached across the table for Levi's hand. "You didn't even consider it." "Nothing to consider," Levi replied simply. "I already have everything I want." The look of love in his eyes made her throat tight with emotion. "Do you ever regret it, settling down instead of continuing as a marshal?" "Not for a single moment," he assured her. "The day I rode into Sacramento and saw you hanging laundry was the luckiest day of my life. Everything good I have came from that moment." Upon their return to Silver Creek, life resumed its pleasant rhythm. James, now 10, was growing into a thoughtful boy with a talent for mathematics and a love of books. Sophia, at 8, was fearless and adventurous, constantly challenging her parents' patience with her escapades. The town continued to prosper, though it maintained its small-town character despite the growth. Margaret and Levi were respected figures in the community, their past in Sacramento largely forgotten or unknown to the newer residents. One autumn afternoon, as Margaret was teaching a reading class in the small schoolhouse she had helped establish, a commotion erupted outside. She heard shouting, then a gunshot. The children looked up in alarm. "Stay here," she instructed the oldest boy. "Keep everyone inside until I return." Outside, she found a crowd gathering near the bank. Her heart stuttered when she saw Levi confronting 3 armed men, his deputies flanking him. Without thinking, Margaret pushed through the onlookers. One of the men, apparently the leader, was shouting at Levi. "We're riding out of here, Sheriff. Anyone tries to stop us, they die." "That's not happening," Levi replied calmly. "Put down your weapons. No one needs to get hurt today." The man laughed harshly. "Always the honorable lawman, aren't you, Sutter? Some things never change." With a jolt, Margaret recognized him older, harder, but unmistakably Durrell, one of the Mason gang who had escaped capture in Sacramento. He must have recognized her too, for his eyes narrowed as she approached. "Well, look who it is," he sneered. "The laundress who turned on us." "Should have known you'd end up with him." Levi's gaze flicked briefly to Margaret. "Stay back," he warned. "Listen to your husband, Mrs. Sutter," Durrell mocked. "Though he couldn't save his sister, could he? Doubt he can save you either." Something changed in Levi's expression at the mention of his sister, a flicker of pain quickly mastered. "You're not riding out of here, Durrell. Not today, not ever." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Durrell raised his gun toward Margaret. Levi lunged forward, his own weapon firing. The other robbers scattered, exchanging shots with the deputies. When the smoke cleared, Durrell lay dead in the street and Levi was on one knee, clutching his side. Margaret ran to him, her heart in her throat. "Levi." "Not bad," he grimaced as she helped him to his feet. "Just grazed me." Later, after the doctor had tended to Levi's wound and the surviving robbers were safely locked in the jail, Margaret sat beside their bed, watching him sleep. The brush with death had shaken her deeply, bringing back memories of Sacramento and the violence that had once seemed so far behind them. When Levi awoke, he found her still sitting there, her face drawn with worry. "You should rest," he murmured. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered. "When I saw you fall. Takes more than the likes of Durrell to keep me from coming home to you." He reached for her hand. "I'm sorry he found us, sorry the past caught up to us like that." Margaret shook her head. "It wasn't your fault, and maybe it's fitting, in a way, closing the circle." "How do you mean?" "We began with the Mason gang," she explained. "Now that chapter is truly finished. Everything that came between our marriage, the children, this life we've built, it's all the stronger for having survived both beginning and end." Levi's recovery took time, during which the town rallied around their sheriff and his family. Meals appeared on their doorstep, neighbors helped with chores, and the children were fussed over by what seemed like every woman in Silver Creek. "I'm beginning to think I should get shot more often," Levi joked as Margaret changed his bandage. "We haven't eaten this well in years." She gave him a stern look. "Don't even jest about such things." By Christmas, Levi was fully recovered, though he spoke of perhaps finally accepting retirement. "I'm not as young as I used to be," he admitted to Margaret as they watched the children open gifts by the fireplace. And I've been thinking about Jonathan Prescott's visit more than I let on. The marshal position, Margaret asked, surprised. I thought you weren't interested. I'm not, he confirmed. But it made me realize there are other things I could do. The town council has asked if I'd consider becoming mayor when old Hobson steps down next year. Margaret considered this. Mayor Sutter does have a nice ring to it. It would mean more regular hours, he pointed out. No more midnight calls for bar fights or chasing down horse thieves. And the children would see more of their father, Margaret added. James is at an age where he needs that. Levi nodded thoughtfully. So you wouldn't mind. Levi Sutter, after 15 years of worrying every time you strap on that gun, I'd welcome the change. His smile was tender as he pulled her closer. 15 years, and still the smartest decision I ever made was asking you to marry me. The second smartest, she corrected with a smile. The smartest was coming to Sacramento in the first place. As the new year dawned, bringing with it the promise of change and new beginnings, Margaret found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. From a laundress washing blood-stained shirts for Outlaws to the wife of Silver Creek's most respected citizen, her life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The phrase that had once seemed a simple statement about her work, "Clean work stays clean," had become the philosophy by which she and Levi lived their lives. Honesty, integrity, and love had washed away the stains of their past, leaving behind a life as bright and hopeful as freshly laundered linen hanging in the sunshine. And as she watched her husband teaching their son to whittle by the fire, their daughter reading aloud from a new book, Margaret knew with certainty that some things, once truly cleaned, remained untarnished forever, much like the love that had begun with a chance encounter between a laundress and a lawman in the wild heart of the American West.